V-Rising looked stupid to me. Oh wow, another generic wannabe MOBA RuneScape Dota 2 thing with the same combat you've seen 100 times, but with vampires. I didn't know what the hell this game was when I saw the trailer and information on Steam. It looks like it would be the last thing to ever catch my interest. I mean, the developers even emailed me and offered me a review code with an exclusive creator package or something, and I left them on red because I wasn't interested. But that all changed when I experienced something called boredom. I was severely wrong, and I'm sorry for not answering your emails, people. V-Rising is really goddamn cool, and it's probably the most invested I've been into a new game since the launch of Valheim. It's extremely addicting, and it's one of those rare titles that you think about when you go to bed and long to play when you wake up. It's a great survival game with a great concept, the perfect amount of grinding, amazing themes and concepts, and room for insane growth and improvement in the near future. It feels like what Valheim could have been before the developers decided to do whatever the hell they're doing now, working over a year and a half with pretty much nothing substantial being added. V-Rising has a huge map with tons of regions to explore, over 40 bosses, raiding, PvP, looting, vampires, and all sorts of cool stuff that really makes it stand out in an oversaturated survival game genre. This game is the real deal, and if you haven't played it because you don't want to or you don't understand what it is, I promise you that you're gonna regret it. While their marketing and their Steam page may not be the most appealing thing ever, this game is actually a lot of fun once you understand what it is and give it a try. I won't say that it's perfect though, there are some very annoying flaws in this game, some things that may turn you off of it, so definitely stay tuned for those. But either way, that's why I'm here today, to inform you about this beautiful indie vampire gem and to tell you why it's so awesome, but also a little bit annoying. So can someone tell me why we haven't seen many vampires in gaming? We have way too many zombie games, countless alien games, Greek mythology games, wizard games, and all sorts of stuff up that alley. But the poor vampires are being left out and forgotten about in the media these days. Yeah, sure, we have Vampire. We have Vampire Fortnite with a battle pass. Never seen that before, whoa! And some other things that are quickly forgotten about when the latest and greatest Activision lazy cash grab comes out. But there's nothing with any longevity or real girth to it. Except, well, V-Rising. V-Rising is the latest and greatest isometric survival game released by Stunlock Studios that has absolutely taken the entirety of Steam by storm, being the top-selling and top-trending game on the entire platform for a few weeks now. Sorry, I'm a bit slow at making videos. But this is an isometric survival game set in a world where vampires are trying to take back the world from the humans that stole it from them. It has MOBA-style combat, a big-ass open world, dozens of different enemies, and a progression system that is quite linear, but still extremely enjoyable. I play this game for the story about as much as I play CSGO for calm and relaxing conversations with the nicest humans in the world, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time blabbering on about that. But as long as you know that you're a vampire and you do a bunch of cool stuff for unimportant reasons, you have the gist. As you spawn into the world, you are cast into a massive environment that is honestly pretty overwhelming at first, and you're tasked with making some basic armor and weapons before you're thrown out to survive on your own, or with friends. You can either play this game solo, on PvE servers where your only fear is the sun, like you're an Irish ginger, or in PvP servers that make you feel like a 9-year-old girl thrown into a women's college rugby team. While the other playstyles are pretty enjoyable, the real fun and most of my experience comes from the PvP servers. At first, you're a weakling vampire with a few basic attacks and whatever shitty weapons you can cobble together by killing skeletons, but your goal is to become an overpowered Dracula and make the entire server your bitch. And to do that, well, it's gonna take a lot of time. As you emerge from the starter area, you have to choose a location to build your initial base. You can pick between Farbane Woods, Dunley Farmlands, Silverlight Hills, Hallowed Mountains, or no, don't even go up there. I promise it's not worth it, and I will show you why in a few minutes. Realistically though, you need to stay in the Farbane Woods region because the map has an extremely linear progression, with the top parts being progressively harder than the bottom. So you can venture up there if you have the balls, but I'd recommend getting situated first by building a base. Too many games do base building wrong and make it a tiring, tedious, and mentally draining process. Oh sorry, you misclicked and placed a wall where you didn't want to? Too bad, it's stuck there, you loser. Oh, you want to build a mega base? You better have the organization skills of goddamn Martha Stewart, because organizing everything requires a PhD in being a virgin. But V-Rising has a really enjoyable, snappy, and simple base building system. You start out with a few basic blueprints for traditional wooden walls, and you have a castle heart, which is the equivalent of a tool cupboard in Rust. The castle heart is how you power all of your machinery, keep your territory protected, and keep your base from decaying. So you have to start out by building simple wooden walls to protect it, but as you progress you can unlock a lot of other blueprints and can eventually expand to a cold, dark vampire castle. The building itself is really simple, and it's really easy to create maze-like structures of airlocks and different room styles to hold all of your machinery, gear, and equipment. You have the ability to truly organize your base for efficiency, with different refinement equipment having different buffs and perks based on how you lay out your base. With my most recent base, I set everything up with different rooms for different activities, like a tailor room, a forge room, an alchemy room, and a big workshop area for all of my grinders and sawmills. Plus, as you progress and unlock these new things, you can easily rearrange your base with a single click, where you don't have to spend forever destroying and replacing everything that becomes irrelevant over time. And you can even upgrade your castle heart to allow for more territory and perks, which I will touch on a bit later. The base building is really enjoyable, and the amount of resources it takes to build things is actually very reasonable, which means that the game is still playable even as a solo. You don't need a Zerg with 15 Chinese sweatshop workers to make progress with your base, and it's quite nice. But progress in your base, and in the entire game for that matter, is impossible without the double-edged sword in the progression of this game: the bosses. V-Rising has 37 bosses total, and they increase in level and difficulty as you move along through them. You track these bosses and you have to kill them in order to unlock new things for your base, new crafting recipes, and new abilities. Each of the bosses are somewhat different, and each one has different attacks and obstacles to overcome while fighting, but they do stay the same every single playthrough. Every time you fight Lydia the Chaos Archer, it is going to be the same thing, and every time you fight Nicholas the Fallen, you're going to get your cheeks clapped. The bosses themselves don't really differ, always spawning in the same place and doing the same moves and yelling the same voice lines, which is good when you're through your second or third playthrough and you just want to get the early grind over with. But because of the repetitiveness of these bosses and the fact that you have to progress through them at the exact same order every time, it does get old the further you play through the game. At first, I was really excited to fight the bosses, and my first experience with the Armorer and the Bandit King and all of these other bosses was super enjoyable and exciting. But every time I restarted in a new server after a wipe, I really just killed these bosses to get it over with and move on with my progression. The game is extremely grindy and linear, which could definitely get old after a certain amount of time, unless you're into that type of thing. But for me personally, it's worth it to continue playing, and I still had enough motivation and other factors keeping me playing to progress through the game. For a lot of other people though, this could be a make or break decision when it comes to buying this game, because every time you play, your path is going to look exactly the same with little to no deviation, so keep that in mind. So while you fight each of the bosses, you're going to have to decide how you want to fight them. In the early game, you have a few simple spells and your stereotypical swords, axes, and spears, just like you would in any other game. But as you kill them, you actually unlock their powers, so you'll have new things and new abilities to use in combat. If this wasn't the case, I don't think I would say the same thing about still tolerating the combat after all this time. Luckily, these abilities do change it up a little bit with every approach, and it keeps you feeling somewhat different the more you get into combat. There are different styles of attacks like Frost, Chaos, Undead, and some others, and while they are different, with some healing you and others catapulting your enemy backwards, they do feel somewhat similar, and I wouldn't say that they're extremely unique, but still fun nonetheless. When you kill these bosses and unlock new powers, you also have new crafting recipes and crafting stations, which you can then use to make stronger weapons and items, to fight harder bosses and repeat until you practically beat the game. These simple swords and spears can later turn into scythes and crossbows, but that's about the full extent of what you can make. Your copper sword can only become a higher tier sword, and a stronger mace is going to replace your old one with these same exact moves. With the game still being early access, the weapon variety is definitely something that could be improved upon, because especially in the later game, it gets a bit repetitive. I went from loving combat to absolutely fucking despising it and having it feel more like a chore than anything else. Not to mention, some of the enemy balancing makes no sense, with warriors doing as much damage as one of those white dogs with shit in their eyes, and then fire archers of the same level absolutely murking you like you got hit by a truck. Plus, these enemies would always come out of nowhere and cause a lot of problems while fighting a boss, which did take some getting used to. The good thing though is that there's honestly a huge variety in the traditional enemies, so as you move along you don't get bored fighting the same simple enemies. In the lower regions there are bandit warriors and tame little archers, but up towards the top there are bombers and big ass spiders and werewolves and, worst of all, nuns. These smaller enemies do in fact have differing approaches depending on what you're dealing with, which makes the combination of fighting these guys and fighting the bosses an interesting enough experience to want to keep playing. If they could just add more weapons with more unique things, kind of like how Terraria has these crazy cool weapons, I think I would have a bit more fun with it. All in all, the combat is what you're going to be doing the most in this game, and it has some room for improvement, but it isn't terrible. Combat does get extremely goddamn irritating at times, and it makes you want to unwind in the local McDonald's playground, but if you have the right loadout and make sure you don't step in the sun, you'll be fine. For real though, you're a vampire, and vampires don't like the sun, and this game reminds you about it. A lot. Because the second you do step in the sun during the day, the most infuriating noise and experience happens to you, and you'll want to rage quit the game. Like I've done. Multiple times. In fact, this game does a lot of cool little things that follow traditional vampire folklore, and it's actually super cool, so I'm going to talk about these things before I touch on one of the best features of the game in a second. So make sure you stay tuned for that. One example that I found of this that was really cool stems from this tiny little button in the bottom of your inventory screen that says compulsively count. In Slavic folklore, vampires are often depicted as having a rhythmomania, where they have an obsessive need to compulsively count things. Hence why this dude from Sesame Street is always counting things. In fact, in this folklore, people would often scatter seeds on the ground of the graves of vampires, where instead of tracking down and killing humans, the vampires would be distracted by the seeds and start counting them. Also, the villagers in the world of V Rising put garlic up on sticks to keep vampires away, because vampires have such strong senses of smell that the garlic is too pungent for them to handle. This same sense of smell is how you track down the bosses because they're allegedly able to smell from miles away. And there's a lot more stuff like this that plays right into the vampire lore, which shows that the developers didn't just make some generic cash grab and that they really were passionate about their game and they cared that everything makes sense. It's pretty nice. Of course, like any vampire, you're gonna have to drink some blood to survive. You have this little thing which is basically your blood tank. Yes, that is the scientific term of where a vampire stores their consumed blood. I fact-checked it. This blood tank kind of works as a hunger bar for your character, and when it's empty, you will die pretty quickly. However, there's a bit more to it than that, and depending on the type of blood you drink, everything can change. There are 6 blood types: Brute, Creature, Rogue, Scholar, Warrior, and Worker. All of the enemies that you come across on your journeys will always have one of these blood types as well as a quality. Basically, the higher the quality of the person's blood that you feast on, the more buffs that you're going to get for that blood type. There's a strategy to what type of blood you consume for what it is you're trying to do, and using this system will make the game much easier for you. For example, if you have high quality worker blood, you get increased resource drops, faster resource destruction, and some other cool perks. Stronger warriors gives you buffs in battle and allows you to do more damage. And higher level creature blood helps you travel around the world slightly faster. And you are gonna need it because traveling in this game absolutely sucks. In fact, traversing around the world is the most infuriatingly annoying and miserable thing in this game, and it's actually one of the main reasons that I added the word annoying in the title. It is so damn irritating. You move around the world at the speed of a crippled 90-year-old, and with the world being so big, and with all of the later stuff being miles away from where you built your massively sprawling, unmovable base, you're going to be traveling around a lot. Like I said before, the base building is sick, and I genuinely love doing it. But because of the way the base building system is designed, with room buffs and all those cool things you need to include in your base becomes massive. So massive that there is no possible way you could ever move it anywhere else. You start out at the bottom and you build at the bottom because you're too weak to survive up top, then you have to travel all the way to the top every time you need something later in the game. Since the progression is linear on the map, you have no choice but to run all the way up there every time you want to kill a boss. You move extremely slow, and if you're traveling in daytime, you also can't go in the sun for more than a few seconds without dying. So the process is absurdly tedious and it takes forever. Most of your time will be spent traveling. And there are also teleport stations, but you can't teleport with any resources on you at all. So teleporting is helpful to get a bit closer to where you need to go, but once you have items, you have to walk back. However, the one thing that does make this slow-ass travel worth it is the map itself. The developers of V Rising did a stellar job at spreading things out, giving the map a natural flow and keeping you engaged. Every region that you have to explore has some mysteries to offer and some cool enemies to engage with, and there's a different reason to go to each and every region because the resources that you need are spread out. Iron ore can only be found at the iron mines, and sulfur is found primarily in the sulfur mines. Each of these areas are on complete opposite sides of the map from each other, but between each of these points are more cool places to see with new items to get and new things to do. Plus, the layout of the map itself is amazing, with roads weaving through points of interest and just enough shade to keep the sun as a challenge, but not a guaranteed death. In fact, the developers were very intentional when it comes to how the world is designed in correlation with the sun, so there's always a little path right outside the main trail that you can follow in relative safety if you need to avoid the sunlight. And this world is also very lively. You've heard me talk about it before, how so many developers these days think that they know what a living, breathing world is, when in reality it has about as much life as my second YouTube channel. But the world in V Rising is extremely interesting and it feels alive. The different types of enemies spread around the map have ongoing conflicts with each other. You'll see bosses killing skeletons, bandits fighting militia, and creatures getting into skirmishes with other creatures. You'll see stone golems fighting archers, and tree ants having territorial battles with these same stone golems. It feels like the world is doing its own thing, and that you're just a small part of the big picture. It's cool to see how NPCs interact with each other and battle each other, and you can even use this mechanic to your advantage. The entire world is destructible too, with these enemies having just as much of an impact on the environment as a player would, so there's some cool things that you could do to take advantage of this. My favorite way is by attracting a stone golem and running around through the forest, dodging attacks, and letting the golem knock down trees for me where I don't have to do it myself. This makes it much more efficient to get wood, and using the environment to your advantage is a good way to make progress a lot faster. And you're definitely going to need progress because this game is a grind. A lot of people look at grinding as the forsaken term, the thing that ruins a game and makes it terrible, but that's not the case. In fact, I actually really like the grind in this game, and it's just fun, minus the miserable traversal that comes along with it. A lot of the resources that you need to craft and research items are dropped primarily from enemies. So you have to go to different areas of the map and kill loads of enemies to get all the resources that you need. I don't find this to be too bad of a thing because it keeps giving you a goal and a reason to play the game. And plus, you can produce a lot of these items at your base at some point after killing bosses. Like yeah, farming scrolls to do higher level research is really annoying at first, but once you kill one of the bosses later in the game, you can actually make it yourself. So yes, there is more grinding than a shitty high school dance at first, but the grinding serves as a way to get what you need in order to produce these things yourself later on. It's the same feedback loop that you see in Factorio, where you grind specific resources in order to obtain those resources much easier later on through easier means. And it's the main reason why I am so addicted to this game. V Rising always has something to do. Unlike many other survival games where once you get geared you sort of plateau, this game keeps you needing more things and keeps you doing whatever it'll take to get those things. You need copper to get iron, and iron to get silver, and so on. There's always more to explore, more resources to gather, more things to build, and more stuff to upgrade. While yes, a lot of people don't like the linear progression, it keeps you entertained because you don't skip big steps of the process if you do things a different way. The process is always there, and you always need to put in time and effort into getting to the next step. On the surface, this game probably sounds a lot like Valheim. Mythology and folklore, bosses, the way progression works, base building. It literally seems like an isometric Valheim. But I haven't mentioned a critical component to this formula. This component is something that really ties everything together, keeps you from getting bored, and adds a whole new level to how you play this game. Multiplayer. You can join a server with 50 plus other players and do this process while fighting against them at the same time. If you're on a PvP server, you have to be a bit on edge because anyone can just come down and kill you, taking all of your resources in the process. These attacks and weapons and spells and all that other stuff I mentioned is done alongside other players, increasing the risk and making the entire experience a lot more fun. A big portion of this progression is getting to the point where you can raid enemy bases with a siege golem and take their loot, furthering your advance into the best vampire on the server. There is an increased risk to all of your actions, and you have to think about your competition around every corner. But you don't have to PvP if you don't want to, as this game gives you freedom to play how you want to play. You can hop on a PvE server and just vibe, or you can even play solo in your own game and just check out what the game has to offer. PvP though is where the game shines, but you can find a server for any playstyle that your heart desires. Like I said though, PvP is the best way to do it because of the cycle. The game would probably get boring if once you beat it, there was nothing else to do. But in PvP servers, there's usually a wipe cycle like you'd find in Rust, where at the end of the cycle you can start fresh and do it all again. Yes, this does sound like it could be annoying, but it's actually the opposite. Once you beat the game, you have a reason to keep playing, to climb the ranks, assert your dominance on the server, and raid vampire plebs. Even with this, I will say that the community is outstanding. A majority of my interactions with other players on these PvP servers were friendly, and there were even times where I traded items with people and formed friendly relationships. But there were times where I felt like being a menace to society, and honestly, these situations were my favorite. V-Rising can be a game of lies and deception if you want it to be, or you can goof off and do stupid shit. It's entirely up to you. Stunlock Studios really knocked it out of the park with V-Rising, and it's one of the most promising indie survival games I've seen in years. I just hope they continue to update it and bring out cool content to keep the community engaged where this game doesn't die out like Valheim did. There are definitely a few things that could use some changes, but for an early access game, holy shit, they killed it. All in all, the game is worth the money in my opinion, and if you have a group of friends to play it with, you definitely should give it a try. There are obviously some very annoying parts like the ones I mentioned in this video, mainly related to the combat and the traversal, but I can ignore those things for the good things that come along with it. What are your thoughts on V-Rising? Does it look as appealing as I make it sound, or do you think it's overrated? Do you think it'll die out like Valheim did? Let me know in the comments. Please follow my Twitter to stay up to date and talk to me about games, and I will see you guys next time. Peace.